If you're like most gardeners, you've probably spent money on fertilizers, tomato feeds, compost boosters, and all kinds of products that promised bigger harvests. And yet somehow the tomatoes still look tired by midsummer. The peppers stop producing the way you hoped, and the potatoes never seem to reach their full potential. I used to do exactly the same thing. Every spring I would buy bags and bottles because I thought healthy plants had to come from something sold at a garden center. What surprised me was discovering that one of the most powerful plant foods I have ever used wasn't in a store at all. It was growing quietly along the edge of a garden, and most people walked right past it without realizing what it could do. The strange thing is that this plant has a reputation that confuses a lot of people. Some know it as an old medicinal herb. Others have heard warnings about it. Many gardeners have never paid attention to it at all. But the people who showed me its real value were Amish growers in Lancaster County. They weren't using it as food. They weren't making tea from it. They weren't taking it as medicine. They were feeding it to the soil. And once I understood why, the whole thing started to make sense. This plant is called Comfrey. It grows fast. It produces huge leaves. But what makes it special is something happening underground where nobody can see it. While most garden plants are feeding near the surface, Comfrey sends roots far down into the soil, much deeper than most vegetables could ever reach. Down there, it pulls up valuable nutrients like potassium, calcium, and magnesium. Then it stores those nutrients in its leaves. In other words, it works almost like a natural mining machine that brings hidden fertility back to the surface for free. And here's where the story gets even more interesting. The same plant that became controversial enough for the FDA to remove Comfrey supplements from the market years ago is still one of the most valuable natural fertilizers a gardener can grow. In the next few minutes, I'll show you exactly why old growers treasured this plant, how Amish gardeners use it today, and why one particular variety changed everything. The reason most gardeners never discover what Comfrey can really do is because they look at it the same way they look at every other plant. They see leaves above ground and assume that's the whole story. I did that myself for years. Then an older gardener showed me something that completely changed the way I looked at it. He told me that if you want to understand Comfrey, don't look at the leaves first. Think about the roots. That's where the real work happens. Most vegetables spend their lives feeding in the top layer of soil. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, beans, and even potatoes depend heavily on nutrients that are relatively close to the surface. The problem is that after years of gardening, those upper layers can become depleted. That's when people start buying more fertilizer every season. They keep adding nutrients from outside because the garden keeps asking for them. But Comfrey works differently. Its roots travel deep into the ground where most vegetables never reach. Down there, it finds potassium, calcium, magnesium, and other minerals that have slowly moved into lower soil layers over time. Then, the plant brings those nutrients back up and stores them inside its huge leaves. When you cut those leaves and place them back into the garden, you're essentially recycling minerals that were hidden far below your crops. Most people never think about that. They see a leaf. The soil sees fertilizer. This is one of the reasons Amish gardeners value Comfrey so much. They understand that a healthy garden is not just about feeding plants. It's about feeding soil first. Years ago, I watched a grower cut armloads of Comfrey leaves and lay them around tomato plants. No expensive bottles. No complicated mixing schedule. Just thick green leaves covering the ground. By the end of summer, those tomatoes looked stronger than many plants receiving commercial feeds every week. And here's where many gardeners make a mistake. They assume more fertilizer automatically means better results. Often, it just means spending more money. Meanwhile, a plant growing quietly in one corner of the property can produce multiple harvests of nutrient-rich leaves every season. The more I learned about Comfrey, the more I realized this wasn't some modern gardening trick. It was part of a much older story that began long before most gardeners had ever heard the name Bocking 14. And that story starts with a journey from Russia to England that changed gardening forever. One of the reasons I enjoy talking about Comfrey is that its story is almost as interesting as the plant itself. Most people assume it has always been a common garden plant, but the version many gardeners use today traveled a long road before it reached modern vegetable gardens. Years ago, I became curious about why some experienced growers seemed so enthusiastic about comfrey, while others avoided planting it altogether. The deeper I looked, the more fascinating the history became. The story starts with a type of comfrey that was brought from Russia to England during the 19th century. At the time, people were searching for plants that could produce large amounts of animal feed and improve agricultural productivity. One of the people who became interested in the plant was Henry Doubleday. He saw potential in comfrey because it grew quickly, produced huge amounts of leafy material, and seemed capable of thriving in conditions where many other crops struggled. Over time, more growers began experimenting with it. Some used it for livestock. Others became interested in its value for compost and soil improvement. But there was a problem that many gardeners eventually discovered. Traditional comfrey could spread very easily. Once established, it often produced seeds that appeared in places where gardeners never intended it to grow. A plant that was useful in one corner of the property could suddenly start showing up elsewhere. For some people, that became frustrating. Then, another important figure entered the story. His name was Lawrence Hills. He spent years studying comfrey and looking for a better solution for gardeners. Eventually, his work led to the development and promotion of a variety known as Bocking 14. This changed everything. Unlike common comfrey, Bocking 14 is sterile. It does not produce viable seeds. That means it stays where you plant it. You can harvest the leaves year after year without worrying about seedlings appearing all over the garden. For many growers, this solved the biggest concern they had about using comfrey. Even today, when experienced gardeners recommend planting comfrey for fertilizer production, they are often talking specifically about Bocking 14. And what makes this even more interesting is that while gardeners were discovering how valuable the plant could be for soil, another side of the comfrey story was beginning to attract attention. Researchers started looking more closely at compounds inside the plant itself, and what they found eventually led to warnings that surprised many people. Now, this is where the story takes a turn that surprises a lot of people. On one hand, you have gardeners and farmers treating comfrey like a valuable crop for building healthy soil. On the other hand, you have health authorities warning people not to consume it. Both things are true at the same time. Comfrey contains compounds called pyrrolizidine alkaloids. You don't need to remember the name. The important part is that these compounds can damage the liver when consumed internally over time. As more research became available, concerns grew about products made from comfrey that were being sold for internal use. Eventually, the FDA took action, and in 2001, comfrey dietary supplements were removed from the market because of those safety concerns. Whenever I talk about comfrey, I think it's important to be completely clear about this. I do not grow it for food. I do not make tea from it. I do not use it internally. The value of comfrey in my garden has nothing to do with eating it. The value comes from feeding the soil. And once you separate those two ideas, the whole picture becomes much easier to understand. A plant can be unsuitable for eating while still being incredibly useful in the garden. In fact, many experienced growers consider comfrey one of the best examples of that principle. The Amish growers I learned from never talked about consuming it. Every conversation focused on what the leaves could do for crops. They saw comfrey as a nutrient pump, a free source of organic matter, a tool for improving soil health, nothing more and nothing less. And this is where most gardeners discover the first practical use for comfrey. They start cutting leaves and using them as mulch. It sounds almost too simple. You cut the large leaves, carry them to your tomatoes, peppers, squash, or potatoes, and lay them directly on the soil around the plants. That's it. No special equipment, no complicated process. As the leaves break down, they slowly release the nutrients they collected from deep underground. The soil stays cooler. Moisture stays in the ground longer. Weeds have a harder time growing. And over time, the leaves disappear and become part of the soil itself. The first time I tried this, I expected small results. What I noticed instead was that the soil underneath those leaves stayed dark, moist, and alive even during hot weather. But mulch is only the beginning, because the next method is the one many Amish gardeners rely on most, and it turns a pile of comfrey leaves into something that looks almost like liquid plant food. The method that impressed me more than anything else was the one many Amish gardeners use when they want a stronger feeding for heavy-producing crops. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, and even potatoes can pull a lot of nutrients from the soil during the growing season. Instead of reaching for bottled fertilizer, they often make what gardeners call Comfrey tea. Now, don't let the word tea confuse you. This is not something for people to drink. This is food for the soil and plants. The process is surprisingly simple. You fill a bucket with freshly cut comfrey leaves and then add water. Some gardeners cover the bucket and leave it for several weeks. During that time, the leaves break down and release the nutrients they stored. The smell can become pretty strong, so I usually keep the bucket away from the house. What remains is a dark liquid that can be diluted with water and used around vegetables. The first time I made it, I honestly wondered if it would be worth the effort. The bucket certainly didn't smell pleasant, but when I started using it around tomatoes and peppers, I understood why so many old growers kept returning to the method year after year. The plants responded with deep green growth and strong flower production. And remember, the reason comfrey works so well is largely because of its high potassium content. Potassium is extremely important when plants are producing flowers and fruit. That's one reason tomatoes, peppers, and squash seem to benefit so much from comfrey-based feeds. But here's a small secret many gardeners miss. You don't always need to make liquid fertilizer. Sometimes the easiest method works just as well. I know growers who simply cut comfrey several times during the season and place the fresh leaves directly around their vegetables. No bucket, no waiting, no mixing. The leaves slowly break down and feed the soil over time. Another place where comfrey shines is the compost pile. Every time you add a layer of nutrient-rich comfrey leaves, you're helping create a more valuable finished compost. Many gardeners even call comfrey a compost activator because it breaks down quickly and helps keep the pile working efficiently. Little by little, I began seeing a pattern. Whether used as mulch, liquid feed, or compost material, comfrey always seemed to be doing the same thing. It was taking nutrients from deep below the garden and cycling them back into the growing system. But there is one more old method that many people have never heard of, and it involves potatoes. One of the oldest uses for comfrey is a method that many modern gardeners rarely hear about anymore. It involves potatoes, and once I saw it done, I understood why some growers still swear by it today. Instead of relying entirely on fertilizer added later in the season, they place fresh comfrey leaves directly into the potato trench before planting. The idea is simple. A layer of leaves goes into the bottom of the trench, then a light covering of soil, and finally the seed potatoes are planted above it. As the season progresses, those leaves slowly break down beneath the plants and release the nutrients they collected from deep underground. It's an old technique that requires almost no extra expense, and that's one reason it appealed to traditional growers. They were always looking for ways to produce more food without constantly buying inputs. What I like about this method is that it follows a pattern you'll see again and again in older gardens. Nothing is wasted. Every resource serves more than one purpose. Comfrey grows. The leaves are harvested. The leaves feed the soil. The soil feeds the crop. Then the crop feeds the family. It's a cycle that repeats itself season after season. I remember trying this method in a small potato bed after hearing about it from an older gardener. I wasn't expecting anything dramatic. What caught my attention wasn't just the harvest. It was the condition of the soil when I dug the potatoes. The earth felt darker, looser, and easier to work. That told me something important was happening below the surface. Healthy soil was being built while food was being grown. Most people focus only on what they harvest above ground. Experienced growers often pay just as much attention to what happens beneath their feet. That's where long-term success comes from. Another thing I learned over the years is that comfrey becomes more valuable the longer you grow it. A single established patch can provide several cuttings every season. You aren't planting it over and over. You aren't replacing it every year. Once mature, it keeps producing armloads of leaves that can be used throughout the garden. Tomatoes get some. Peppers get some. Compost gets some. Potatoes get some. The same plant serves multiple jobs. And for gardeners trying to save money while growing healthier crops, that combination is hard to ignore. But perhaps the biggest lesson Comfrey taught me wasn't about fertilizer at all. It was about looking at the garden differently. And that's exactly where this story leads next. When I look back at everything Comfrey has done in my garden, the biggest surprise is not that it helped my tomatoes produce better or that it made compost richer. The biggest surprise is how much money and effort it saved over the years. So many gardeners are taught that growing good vegetables requires a constant stream of products. New fertilizers, new boosters, new additives every season. Yet one of the most useful plants I have ever grown asks for very little once it is established. It simply keeps producing leaves, year after year, cut after cut, and every harvest becomes another opportunity to feed the soil naturally. That doesn't mean comfrey is a miracle plant. Nothing in gardening is a miracle. Healthy gardens still need good soil, proper watering, sunlight, and patience. But comfrey fits into that system in a way that feels practical and sensible. It works with nature instead of against it. It takes nutrients from deep underground and returns them to the part of the garden where vegetables can use them. It helps build compost. It helps create mulch. It helps support crops that demand a lot from the soil. And it does all of that without requiring another trip to the store. If someone asked me today where to start, I would tell them to look for Bocking 14. That sterile variety solves many of the concerns people have about comfrey spreading through seeds. Plant it in a spot where it can stay for years. Give it time to establish. Then start harvesting leaves and putting them to work throughout the garden. Just remember the important distinction that often gets lost in conversations about comfrey. This is not a plant I recommend for eating or drinking. The concerns about liver toxicity are real, and that's why products intended for internal use faced serious restrictions years ago. For me, comfrey belongs in the soil. That's where its value shines. That's where it earns its place. The Amish growers who first drew my attention to comfrey understood something simple. Healthy crops begin with healthy soil. The leaves of this plant are not food for people. They are food for the earth. And when the soil becomes stronger, the tomatoes become stronger. The peppers become stronger. The potatoes become stronger. Everything starts from there. And once you see comfrey through that lens, you may never look at a patch of those large green leaves the same way again. In fact, there is another forgotten plant that old growers often paired with comfrey for even greater results in the garden, and that's a story worth exploring next time.